I did Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy with John Hurt and many other wonderful actors, but I adored John.
There is a scarf, just a scarf, old vintage Paul Smith, the kind of thing that has no business mattering as much as it does. But when Gary Oldman talks about it, something in his voice goes very quiet and very still, and you understand immediately that this piece of fabric is carrying something far heavier than wool. At 68, Sir Gary Oldman, one of the most decorated and fearless actors Britain has ever produced, sat down and told the world a story about a friend he lost, about a man he loved, about a scarf he gave away, and the long, sad, beautiful journey it took to find its way back to him. But to understand why that story hit the way it did, you first have to understand who Gary Oldman is and where he came from, because nothing about the life that produced this man was ever simple. Gary Leonard Oldman was born on March 21st, 1958, in the working-class neighborhood of New Cross in southeast London. His father, Leonard, was a welder and a former sailor and an alcoholic who walked out the front door one day when Gary was 7 years old and never came back. His mother, Kathleen, worked 2 jobs, including singing in pubs to keep 3 children fed and sheltered. That image, his mother turning pain into something an audience could sit inside for an hour, stayed with Gary long after he had words to describe what it meant. He left school at 16 with no qualifications and found work in a sports shop. It was not a future. It was just what you did when the future hadn't arrived yet. Then one evening around the age of 13, he went to the cinema and watched Malcolm McDowell in The Raging Moon. Something happened to him in that dark room that he has never been able to fully explain, only to describe. Something about Malcolm just arrested me, and I connected and I said, I want to do that. He applied to RADA, the most prestigious drama school in Britain. They turned him down and told him to find another line of work. For many people, that would have been the end of the story. For Gary Oldman, it was the beginning of it. He found his way to the Greenwich Young People's Theatre, earned a scholarship to Rose Bruford College, and graduated in 1979 with a degree in acting. That same year, he made his professional stage debut at the Theatre Royal in York. He was 21 years old, a long way from New Cross, and the beginning had officially begun. The early 1980s were a grind of repertory theatre. Glasgow, Colchester, the Royal Court in London. He was developing a reputation as someone who didn't just play characters, but seemed to inhabit their nervous systems. Film was the next frontier, and film was not paying attention yet. His debut came in 1982 in a small drama called Remembrance. Nobody particularly noticed. But Gary kept working, kept pushing, and the break, the one that changes the shape of everything, was still somewhere just ahead. It arrived in 1986 in the form of a dead punk rocker from East London. Alex Cox's Sid and Nancy cast Gary as Sid Vicious, the Sex Pistols bassist, whose relationship with American groupie Nancy Spungen became one of rock history's most notorious and tragic love stories. Gary had to not just play Sid, he had to become him. He lost weight, learned the posture, studied the footage, absorbed the chaos. He was so convincingly Sid Vicious that John Lydon, the actual Johnny Rotten, who had known the real Sid, praised his performance, even though Lydon despised the film itself. Gary even sang in character on several of the soundtrack recordings alongside original Sex Pistols member Glenn Matlock. That detail tells you everything about how he works. Not up to the line, but past it, through it, into whatever is on the other side. The film made him a name, and then the names started coming in. In 1987, he played Joe Orton, the brilliant, outrageous playwright murdered by his lover, Kenneth Halliwell, in Prick Up Your Ears. In 1988 came Bram Stoker's Dracula, where Francis Ford Coppola cast him in the title role, allowing Gary to do something that few actors had managed, make Dracula both terrifying and heartbreaking. "I have crossed oceans of time to find you." He has said himself that he knew the moment he read that line that he had to say it, that he could hear it in his head before he could physically produce it. That line and that performance became one of the defining entries in the mythology of screen villainy. Then came one of the most gloriously strange chapters of his career. JFK, Oliver Stone's 1991 political epic, gave Gary the role of Lee Harvey Oswald. Not a villain in the traditional sense, something more unsettling, a man whose guilt or innocence remained in permanent, historically sanctioned doubt. Gary brought to Oswald the same thing he brought to everything, the sense that somewhere behind the face, a whole interior life was in constant, agonized motion. He has talked about working with Stone as one of the experiences that sharpened what he understood about the relationship between an actor and a director, the way a great director can trust you to go somewhere without a map, and the way that trust either liberates or terrifies you, usually both at once. In 1994 came Leon, the Professional, Luc Besson's stylized thriller in which Gary played Norman Stansfield, a corrupt DEA agent who became one of cinema's most unhinged, operatic antagonists. The famous scene in which Stansfield screams, "Everyone!" at the top of his lungs was, Gary has revealed, entirely improvised as a joke to make Besson laugh. He remembers specifically warning the sound guy beforehand, "Be careful of your ears, because I'm going to do this one really, really loud." It made Luke laugh, and it ended up in the film. An entire iconic moment in cinema history, born from one actor trying to make his director smile on a long shooting day. True Romance gave him Drexel the Pimp. Air Force One gave him a Russian terrorist who hijacked the president's plane. The Fifth Element gave him the magnificently ludicrous Jean-Baptiste Emmanuel Zorg, a comic villain Gary has admitted he could barely remember afterward, though the audience has never forgotten the rubber costume or the Jean-Paul Gaultier aesthetic. These were the years when Gary Oldman became cinema shorthand for a particular quality, the villain who is more alive than anyone else on screen, whose scenes you can't look away from even when they terrify you. But he was not just villains, he was also George Smiley. In 2011, director Tomas Alfredson cast Gary in the lead role of John le Carré's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, the film adaptation of the Cold War spy novel that had already become legendary through the 1979 BBC television series starring Alec Guinness. To step into those shoes was, by any measure, one of the most daunting things Gary Oldman had ever agreed to do. George Smiley is not a role you can overplay. He is all restraint, all stillness, all the things that vibrate beneath the surface rather than above it. Gary said of the character that he approached him like a wise owl, very still, and then they just move their head, and there is a quality about it. He wanted all the knowledge and watchfulness to come through without noise, without gesture, through the silence that fills the space around a man who has seen too much. The film won the BAFTA for Outstanding British Film. And for Gary, it did something else. It gave him his first Academy Award nomination for Best Actor after more than 25 years in the industry. He was 53 years old. He found out about the nomination while he was in Berlin doing press. His producing partner came into the room and said, "Congratulations, you're an Academy Award nominee." Gary has said he remembers exactly where he was sitting when he heard those words. That is the kind of thing you don't forget. The moment when the world officially catches up to something you have been doing your whole life. But the film gave him something even more important than a nomination. It gave him the set in which he first spent real time with John Hurt. And here is where the story changes shape entirely. John Vincent Hurt was born on January 22, 1940, in Chesterfield, Derbyshire. Over 6 decades, he built one of the most quietly devastating careers in British acting history, from the Emperor Caligula in I, Claudius, to the chest-bursting victim in Alien, from Joseph Merrick, buried under layers of extraordinary prosthetics in The Elephant Man, to Mr. Ollivander, placing the first wand in Harry Potter's hands. 2 Oscar nominations, 0 wins, an injustice that the industry never quite answered for. In 2011, he played Control, the head of MI6, in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. And on that set, for the first time, he and Gary Oldman shared a room. Gary has described the experience of meeting John Hurt as something close to meeting a hero, while quietly terrified of disappointing him. He was a fanboy, he has said, an unashamed, deeply sincere fanboy who arrived on that set knowing exactly who John Hurt was and what he had accomplished, and who found, in the way that only the rarest encounters deliver, that the man in person exceeded every expectation. John was a darling, Gary has said, a great storyteller, a man of warmth and humor and a generosity of spirit that people who had never met him somehow already sensed from watching him on screen. They laughed together constantly on that set. They talked between takes. A friendship took root in the soil of a Cold War spy thriller, which is perhaps exactly the right kind of soil for something that was going to last. Then, after filming wrapped, life moved on the way it does. Gary went back to his work. John went back to his. They crossed paths again when Gary caught up with John in California, where John was performing in Samuel Beckett's Krapp's Last Tape, that desolate, beautiful one-man play in which an old man sits alone with a tape recorder and listens to the voice of his younger self and tries to understand where everything went. Gary went backstage afterward to see him, and one of the first things John said, with the attention to small, beautiful things that defined him, was, "Oh, I love your scarf." Gary took it off, placed it around John's neck, said, "It's yours now." That was the kind of man Gary Oldman is. Not the villain, not the chameleon, not the Oscar winner. The man who gives his scarf to someone he loves because they said they loved it. John died on January 25, 2017, of pancreatic cancer. He was 77 years old. He had been diagnosed in 2015, had received the all clear later that year, and had continued working, because John Hurt was the kind of man who continued working right up until near the end. His final film was Jackie, Pablo Larraín's biographical drama about Jacqueline Kennedy, in which John played a priest. His wife Anwen wrote in her tribute that John was the most sublime of actors and the most gentlemanly of gentlemen, with the greatest of hearts and the most generosity of spirit. She said he had touched all our lives with joy and magic, and that it would be a strange world without him. It was a strange world without him. For Gary, losing John was not a public grief performed for cameras. It was a private loss of someone specific, someone whose company had meant something real, the kind of loss that arrives quietly and stays. And then, 2024, Gary went back to York, back to the Theatre Royal where he had made his professional debut in 1979. The boy from New Cross who had been turned away from RADA and found his way to a Christmas pantomime in Yorkshire. He went back to play Krapp's Last Tape, the same Samuel Beckett play that John Hurt had performed in California all those years ago, the play that had been in the room the night Gary gave his scarf away. There was a further layer that no one could have planned. The reel-to-reel tape recorder Gary used in his production at York, the same machine that sat on the table through every performance, through every banana, through every silence, was the same tape recorder that John Hurt had used in his own performance of the play, and the same one Michael Gambon had used, both now gone. Gary dedicated his performance to their memory. He performed Krapp's Last Tape at York Theatre Royal from April to May 2025, then transferred it to the Royal Court in London, the theatre where he had done so much of his early work in the 1980s, and where Krapp's Last Tape had first played in 1958. He directed the production himself. He designed the set himself. The stage was crowded with boxes and books and the accumulated detritus of a life, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, Gary Oldman sat with a tape recorder and a banana and the voice of his younger self, and let the play do what it has always done. John's widow, Anwen, came to see the performance in York. She came backstage afterward, as Gary had once come backstage to see John. She gave Gary a first-night card, something she had originally made and given to John, now beautifully framed, to pass on, to mark the connection. And then she reached into a little bag and produced the scarf, the old vintage Paul Smith that Gary had placed around John's neck with two hands and no hesitation all those years ago. She gave it back to him. Gary has tried to describe what that moment was. He says, it went all the way around. The scarf went out, and it came back in a sad but very beautiful way. He says he sometimes puts it on now, just to have John with him, to say, hello, Johnny. That's what he says when he puts the scarf on. Hello, Johnny. John Hurt was never given an Oscar. That particular injustice has been noted by fans and critics for decades. 2 nominations, 0 wins, for a body of work that redefined what British screen acting could mean. Gary Oldman has said nothing publicly about that specific wound, but those who know how he speaks about John, with what tenderness, what unguarded admiration, understand that he feels it. You can hear it in the way he talks about John's talent, not as something to be explained, but as something to be stood beside and appreciated in silence, the way you stand beside something enormous and simply acknowledge that you are not equal to it. Today, Sir Gary Oldman, knighted by King Charles III in the 2025 birthday honors, carries everything he has built across more than 40 years into a role that may be the most purely himself he has ever played. Jackson Lamb in Slow Horses on Apple TV Plus is brilliant, disheveled, flatulent, and ferociously intelligent. A man who says the things everyone wishes they could say and suffers no consequences for it, because Gary Oldman makes every moment of him feel completely, uncomplicatedly alive. He has described Jackson as the character he has been able to explore most deeply over the longest stretch of time. With a film, he has said, you have 2 hours, and then it is done. With a series, you keep peeling back layers. There is always more. And then there is the theater. Because for Gary Oldman, the theater has never been just where he started. It has been the constant, the place he keeps returning to, because the stage is honest in a way cameras cannot quite replicate. You cannot cut. You cannot do another take. It is just you and the audience and the play, and either you are there or you are not. In 2025, he went back to York, back to the Theatre Royal, where he had made his very first professional appearance in 1979, to perform Krapp's Last Tape, the same Samuel Beckett play that John Hurt had performed in California all those years ago, the same play that had been in the room the night Gary gave his scarf away. He used the same reel-to-reel tape recorder that John had used in his own production. He dedicated the entire performance to John's memory. Grief is the price of loving. One of the comments left under the original interview said exactly that, and it is exactly right. The grief Gary carries for John Hurt is not separate from the love. It is the love, transformed by loss into something that lasts forever and costs you daily. He puts on a scarf. He says hello to his friend. He plays a play on a machine that John once used, in a theater where he himself once started, and he lets the whole thing mean what it means. Two men from the same strange, demanding world of British acting. Two men who met on a Cold War spy film and found, between the takes and behind the cameras, something that no script supervisor could have written down. That is the story Gary Oldman finally told, and it is impossible to hear it and remain unmoved. The comments left by audiences after Gary told that story say everything the story itself leaves unsaid. John Hurt never winning an Oscar has always been insane to me. Everyone adored John Hurt. Grief is the price of loving. Gary Oldman and John Hurt, class acts. And perhaps most perfectly of all, because this is what it is to watch two extraordinary people share a world with the rest of us. Who loves Gary Oldman? Everyone. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on those notifications so you never miss a story like this. Leave us a comment below. What is your favorite Gary Oldman performance? Or your favorite John Hurt role? We would love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.